A regiment of farm boys, mill workers, and clerks from Oshkosh, Wisconsin marched over 2,000 miles, fought from the swamps of Mississippi all the way to the Carolinas, and then stood at the largest single surrender of the entire Civil War. Today, we're pulling that story out of the archives. We're covering the 32nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment, where they came from, what they actually did on the ground campaign by campaign, and why the post-historian's record of their service argues they were operationally decisive in ways that go way beyond a body count. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how a regiment that suffered relatively few casualties still managed to help bring the Confederacy to its knees. I've got someone who has gone deep into this record with me today, so let's get into it. Walk me through who these men actually were before they ever picked up a rifle.
So the 32nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment was organized in the summer of 1862. And the context matters here. Lincoln had just issued a call for 300,000 more volunteers. The Union needed bodies, and Wisconsin answered. The regiment recruited primarily from Winnebago, Outagamie, Fond du Lac, Marquette, and Calumet counties. So this is very much a regional unit. These are neighbors, people who knew each other from the same towns and farms.
So it's not like they were pulling from across the whole state.
Right, it's hyper-local, and that matters for unit cohesion. The regiment was officially mustered into service on September 25, 1862, with an initial strength of somewhere between 900 and 1,000 men. Their first commander was Colonel James H. Howe, a Wisconsin lawyer who later became a U.S. district attorney, so not a career military man. That's actually pretty typical for volunteer regiments of this era.
And where did all of this happen? Where did they actually train?
Camp Bragg in Oshkosh. And the record describes it in this really vivid way. Imagine standing on the southern edge of Oshkosh in late August 1862, morning sun burning off mist from the Fox River, rows of white canvas tents, cook fires, farm boys and mill workers and clerks trying to learn the manual of arms with Springfield muskets, a sergeant with a booming voice correcting their posture. Local families gathered at the perimeter fence, waving to sons and brothers.
That image is striking. It's so ordinary almost. These are just regular people.
That's exactly the point the post-historian is making. And Camp Bragg itself has an interesting story. It was named for Edward S. Bragg, colonel of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry and later a brigadier general, who fought in the Iron Brigade through the Peninsula Campaign, Antietam, and Gettysburg. So the camp honoring him becomes the birthplace of the 32nd Wisconsin.
Wait, so the camp is named after someone from a completely different regiment?
Yeah, that's how it worked. These camps were named to honor distinguished figures, not necessarily the units training there. And Camp Bragg was located near what is now the intersection of Hazel Street and East Irving Avenue in Oshkosh, chosen specifically for open terrain and proximity to rail transport, so they could deploy quickly once the regiment was ready.
And Wisconsin had a whole network of these camps, right? It wasn't just Oshkosh.
Wisconsin maintained one of the most extensive networks of training camps in the entire Union, which reflects how seriously the state took mobilization. You had Camp Randall in Madison, named for Governor Alexander Randall, who pledged Wisconsin's 1st Regiment immediately after Fort Sumter and ultimately sent 70,000 soldiers into service. Multiple camps in Milwaukee, camps in Janesville, Fond du Lac, Kenosha, La Crosse.
70,000 soldiers from one state. That's a staggering number.
It really is. And the Milwaukee camps alone, they went through several renamings, each honoring a different figure. Camp Holton, then Camp Siegel for the German-American Union General Franz Siegel, then Camp Reno for Jesse Reno, who was killed at South Mountain. Nearly 7,000 men passed through just that one Milwaukee site.
So by the time the 32nd left Camp Bragg, they were part of this enormous Wisconsin war machine.
Exactly. And they departed on October 30, 1862, heading to Memphis. They arrived November 3rd, attached to forces supporting Grant's early Vicksburg operations. So within about 5 weeks of being officially mustered in, they're in the Western Theater.
That's fast. Barely enough time to figure out which end of the rifle to point.
Well, they had about a month of drilling at Camp Bragg, which was the standard. And their first assignment was not glamorous at all. Garrison duty, railroad guard duty in Kentucky and Tennessee, protecting supply lines. It sounds boring, but the record is clear. This was dangerous work. They were constantly skirmishing with Confederate cavalry and guerrilla forces along the Memphis to La Grange to Moscow corridor.
So no big set-piece battles early on, just this grinding, constant, low-level threat.
Right. And that's actually where you start to see what kind of regiment the 32nd was going to be. They repulsed an attack at Moscow, that's in Tennessee, protecting Hatch's cavalry. Not a famous engagement, not something you'd find in a general history of the war, but operationally important.
And then comes Vicksburg, which is one of the most famous campaigns of the entire war. What was the 32nd's role there?
So this is interesting because the 32nd did not participate in the siege of Vicksburg itself. They were not in the trenches around the city. But the Post historian makes a strong argument that their role was still essential. They were guarding the supply routes feeding Grant's army, protecting railroads and depots in western Tennessee and northern Mississippi, running anti-guerrilla operations that kept Grant's logistical network functioning.
So Grant's army couldn't have sustained the siege without that supply chain being protected.
That's the argument, yeah. And it's a legitimate one. Armies don't just fight, they eat, they move ammunition, they need those lines intact. The 32nd was part of the infrastructure that made Vicksburg possible, even if they weren't the ones accepting the Confederate surrender.
Okay, so then we get to February 1864 and the Meridian Campaign. This is where things start to get more direct, right?
Yeah, this is where you start seeing the 32nd in actual sharp engagements. Sherman leads this expedition into Mississippi to destroy Confederate infrastructure, railroads, depots, industrial sites, and the 32nd has a specific moment that the record highlights. They held a pontoon bridge at Jackson until the entire army crossed, then destroyed it. While they were wrecking the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, a Confederate cavalry brigade attacked them.
And what happened?
The record says they repulsed the assault, quote, handsomely, which is a great 19th century way of saying they handled it decisively. They preserved the work party and held their position. And the Meridian Campaign itself was significant because it was essentially a prototype for what Sherman would later do in Georgia, the idea of destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war rather than just fighting their armies.
So the 32nd was part of Sherman learning his own strategy, in a way.
That's a really good way to put it. And then there's the Cortland and Decatur operations in mid-1864 that show another dimension of what this regiment dealt with. Near Cortland, Alabama, detachments from companies A, C, D, and F engaged a larger Confederate force and were initially forced back. The next day, with brigade-level support, the 32nd led the advance, 7 miles, and routed the enemy from his main position.
So they took a hit one day and came back the next day leading the charge.
Exactly. And there's another action near Cortland where they were guarding a wagon train, got attacked by a superior force, repulsed repeated assaults, brought the train safely into camp, and then helped drive the enemy from nearby works the following day. That's 2 days of sustained defensive and offensive action around a supply train.
I want to pause on something here because I think it's easy to hear wagon train defense and think that sounds minor, but you're describing a regiment that keeps showing up in these logistical roles that are actually holding the whole operation together.
That's the through line of the 32nd's entire service. And the Post historian is very deliberate about making that argument. These aren't the flashy headline battles, but they are the work that keeps an army moving. And then you get to the Atlanta campaign, which is where the 32nd sees its most sustained combat.
Okay, so Atlanta, this is the big one. What did they actually do?
They were in it from the approach all the way through. Resaca, Dallas, New Hope Church, the Kennesaw Mountain operations, the siege of Atlanta, and then Jonesboro. And the siege itself, the record says the regiment was, quote, constantly under fire from late July to August 24. Rifle pits, artillery, skirmish lines, manning frontline works, supporting assaults, enduring counter-battery fire.
Constantly under fire for almost a month.
Nearly. And then Jonesboro, at the end of August and into September 1864, that's the action that forced Confederate General Hood to evacuate Atlanta. The 32nd was part of the pressure on Confederate lines that broke the rail connections and compelled the withdrawal. So they're there for the moment. Atlanta falls.
And then Sherman pivots almost immediately to the march to the sea.
Right. As part of the 17 Corps, the 32nd Wisconsin marched from Atlanta to Savannah. Their duties on that march included destroying railroads and Confederate infrastructure, foraging operations, the soldiers doing that were called bummers, skirmishing with Confederate cavalry, and securing crossings over rivers and swamps. They reached Savannah in December 1864.
So at this point, they've gone from Oshkosh to Memphis to Mississippi to Alabama to Atlanta to Savannah. That's an extraordinary distance.
And they're not done. January 1865, the Carolinas campaign begins. Sherman turns north from Savannah with the goal of driving through South Carolina into North Carolina, linking with Grant in Virginia, and extinguishing the last Confederate field army still capable of organized resistance. And the 32nd is marching with him.
Who are they up against at this point?
General Joseph Johnston, who had been recalled in desperation to gather the remnants of the Army of Tennessee, state troops, militia, whatever was left, into something that might at least delay the inevitable. The record is pretty blunt about Johnston's situation. He understood the hopelessness of his position, especially after the fall of Charleston and the steady disintegration of Confederate logistics. But he resolved to make one final attempt.
That's a grim position to be in. Fighting a war you know you've already lost.
It really is. And the 32nd's first major action in the Carolinas is at Rivers Bridge, which spanned the Salkehatchie River in South Carolina. They helped force crossings through swamp and flooded ground under fire. And this is where something interesting happens. Second Lieutenant Henry Markham of Company G was wounded in that action.
Henry Markham, that name rings a bell for some reason.
It should. Henry Markham later became the governor of California. So you have a man who crossed a flooded swamp under Confederate fire as a lieutenant in the 32nd Wisconsin and then went on to govern one of the largest states in the country. That's the kind of post-war trajectory that shows you the caliber of people in this regiment.
That's wild. Okay, so after Rivers Bridge, they're pushing north toward Bentonville.
Bentonville, March 19 to 21, 1865. This is Johnston's last real opportunity to strike. He attempts to catch Sherman's left wing isolated near this small crossroads. On March 19, he launches a concentrated attack that initially drives back portions of the Union line and threatens to inflict a rare tactical reverse on Sherman. The situation is genuinely precarious.
So Sherman is actually in trouble for a moment.
Briefly, yes. And what stabilizes the field is the arrival of the right wing, which includes the 5th T Corps, and the 32nd Wisconsin within it, marching rapidly toward the sound of the fighting. Their arrival helps prevent Johnston from turning a temporary advantage into a decisive victory. The 32nd takes its place in the tightening Union line and contributes to the pressure that gradually forces Johnston back.
So they're not the ones doing the heaviest fighting on day one, but they're the ones who close the door.
Exactly. Over the next 2 days, as Sherman brings his full strength to bear, the Confederate position becomes untenable. Johnston withdraws toward Raleigh. Bentonville passes into history as the last major battle of the Carolinas campaign. And the 32nd Wisconsin is there for all of it.
And then comes the surrender. Walk me through what happens at Bennett Place.
So after Bentonville, Sherman's army advances on Raleigh. Lee has surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. Johnston's army is hungry, demoralized, and dwindling. On April 11th, Johnston learns of Lee's capitulation and concludes that further bloodshed serves no purpose. He opens communications with Sherman, and the two generals meet at the Bennett farmstead between Raleigh and Durham Station, beginning on April 17th.
And that's also when Sherman learns about Lincoln's assassination.
Right. The record notes that Sherman learned of Lincoln's assassination on the morning of their first meeting. So the negotiations are happening under this enormous shadow of political shock and turmoil in Washington. But the military reality is unmistakable. On April 26, 1865, Johnston surrenders all Confederate forces under his command. The record calls it the largest single capitulation of the war.
Larger than Appomattox?
In terms of the scope of the surrender, Johnston's capitulation covered all Confederate forces under his command across multiple states, not just one army. And the 32nd Wisconsin stood with Sherman's army near Raleigh when that surrender was finalized. They had marched from Atlanta through Savannah, across South Carolina into North Carolina. They helped secure the field at Bentonville. They participated in the occupation of Raleigh, and they were present at the end.
The Post historian has this line about that, right? Something about why they were present at the end.
Yeah, it's one of the most striking lines in the record. Quote, "The 32nd Infantry were present at the end because they had never faltered along the way." That's the argument. Their distinction in the final campaign rested not on a single dramatic charge, but on consistent, disciplined endurance, rapid maneuvering, and steady combat readiness that allowed Sherman's strategy to succeed.
That framing is really interesting to me because we tend to remember wars through their dramatic moments, the charges, the famous last stands. But what you're describing is a regiment whose value was almost the opposite of that.
The Post historian calls it quiet, relentless competence. And I think that's actually a harder thing to sustain than a single moment of heroism. Heroism is a spike. What the 32nd did was maintain a baseline of reliability across 3 years and thousands of miles. That's a different kind of achievement.
And what were the actual casualty numbers? Because you mentioned earlier that they suffered relatively few compared to other Wisconsin regiments.
So the record puts their killed in action at only 70. 200 died of disease while encamped or on the march. Total casualties approximately 270. For a regiment that fought in every major campaign from 1863 to 1865, Atlanta, the March to the Sea, the Carolinas, that's a remarkably low number.
Disease killing more men than combat. That's a pattern across the Civil War, isn't it?
It's actually the pattern of the Civil War. More soldiers died of disease than in battle across both sides. And the 32nd's exposure was particularly acute during garrison and railroad duty. Company E, for instance, had heavy exposure to disease during those periods. The record notes it specifically.
So after the surrender, what happens to the regiment?
They march north. The campaign movements record shows them going from North Carolina through Virginia to Washington, D.C. for what the record calls the Pass and Review, the Grand Review of the Armies. And then they muster out on June 12, 1865, in Washington, D.C. Later that summer, the regiment is formally disbanded.
So they end where the nation's capital is. There's something fitting about that.
And the Grand Review itself was this enormous public moment, the Union armies marching through Washington as a demonstration of what had been accomplished. For the men of the 32nd Wisconsin, farm boys and mill workers from Oshkosh, to march down Pennsylvania Avenue in that context, that's a long way from Camp Bragg.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. The Post historian raises this question about whether the 32nd Infantry Division of World War I was named to honor the 32nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment. What's the actual status of that claim?
So the record is very careful here. The Post historian says explicitly, no documentation exists which proves the 32nd Infantry Division was so named to honor the men who preserved the Union. But also, no record exists that it did not. It's an open question.
That's a very honest caveat.
It is. But the Post historian's personal view is that it's difficult to believe Brigadier General Boardman, who was forging the 32nd Division for World War I, did not insist on that designation to draw upon the legacy of Wisconsin's 32nd Volunteer Infantry. The argument is that armies don't win wars with esprit des corps grounded in myth. They win with esprit des corps founded on legacy.
And if it turns out to be coincidence?
The Post historian has a great line about that too. Quote, "If coincidence proves the wit behind the choice, I regard that as providence," which I think is a genuinely elegant way to handle historical ambiguity.
There's also the connection to American Legion Post 70 in Oshkosh, which is why this record exists at all. Can you explain that link?
So the record was compiled by the Post historian of American Legion Post 70 in Oshkosh. The Post has a specific interest in the 32nd and 21st Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiments because the majority of their members were drawn from Oshkosh and the immediate Winnebago County region. The 32nd is described as the banner bearer for Winnebago County's esprit de corps. Because the U.S. Army has never fielded a 21st Division since the Civil War, the 32nd remains the connecting thread.
So this is a community actively maintaining its own military legacy across generations.
That's exactly what it is. And the record notes that in 1915, local veterans erected the Camp Bragg Memorial, marking the site where thousands of Wisconsin soldiers began their wartime journey. That's 50 years after the war ended, and the community is still marking the ground.
And the Post historian notes that the full roster research, company lists, officers, NCOs, casualty details is still a near-term goal. So this is a living project.
Right. The Wisconsin Historical Society holds complete unit rosters, full company lists from A through K, officers, NCOs, enlisted men, casualty lists, service notes, transfers. The Post historian acknowledges that the research hasn't drilled down to that level yet, but it's the direction they're heading, which means there's more of this story still to be told.
I find that kind of exciting, actually. The idea that there are still names and stories in those archives waiting to be connected to what we've been talking about.
And some of those names are already remarkable. Company D produced at least one later Wisconsin legislator, George F. Caldwell, who later transferred to the 16th. Company F had David G. Williams, who rose to sergeant and later became a state legislator. And then there's Henry Markham in Company G, future governor of California, wounded at Rivers Bridge. These are men whose Civil War service was just the beginning of their public lives.
So when you step back from all of this, the formation at Camp Bragg, the years of grinding campaign service, the surrender at Bennett Place, the march to Washington, What does the 32nd Wisconsin story actually tell us?
I think it tells us something important about how wars are actually won. We have this cultural tendency to remember the dramatic moments, the charges, the famous last stands, the generals on horseback. But the 32nd Wisconsin's record is an argument that the war was won by regiments that showed up, did the unglamorous work, held the supply lines, crossed the swamps, and kept moving. 70 killed in action across 3 years of hard campaigning, 200 dead of disease, and they were present at the largest surrender of the war.
The post-historian's phrase keeps coming back to me. Quiet, relentless competence. There's something almost counterintuitive about that being the thing that ends a war.
It is counterintuitive, but Sherman's entire strategy in the final year of the war depended on infantry that could move fast, sustain themselves in hostile territory, and arrive where needed. The 32nd Wisconsin repeatedly proved equal to that demand. Their steadiness wasn't dramatic in the theatrical sense, but it was operationally decisive. That's the post-historian's core argument, and the campaign record backs it up.
And there's a real-world implication here for how we think about military history more broadly. The units that get remembered are usually the ones with the most dramatic stories, but the units that actually determined outcomes might be the ones doing exactly what the 32nd was doing.
Exactly. And that's why records like this one matter. The post-historian is doing the work of making sure that a regiment from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, farm boys and mill workers who answered Lincoln's call in 1862, doesn't get swallowed by the larger narrative. They marched from Camp Bragg to Bennett Place. They deserve to be remembered by name.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We started with this image of raw recruits on the southern edge of Oshkosh, struggling with their Springfield muskets, families waving from the perimeter fence, and we end with those same men, or the ones who survived, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in the grand review of the armies. That arc is extraordinary.
And the arc connects directly to the present. The Camp Bragg Memorial erected in 1915. American Legion Post 70 maintaining this record today. The Wisconsin Historical Society holding those complete rosters. The story of the 32nd Wisconsin isn't finished. It's being actively recovered. And every name that gets pulled from those archives adds another thread to what the post-historian calls Winnebago County's esprit de corps.
We started this episode with a regiment almost nobody knows by name. And I think what the post-historian's record makes clear is that anonymity is a choice. It's what happens when communities stop doing the work of remembering. The 32nd Wisconsin fought from Mississippi to the Carolinas, helped end the largest war in American history, and marched home to Oshkosh. The least we can do is know their story.